So thanks, guys, for staying. I want to just do some quick introductions. I trust if you don't know who these folks are, that most of you do already, and you can click on it. We've got a lot of stuff we want to cover here in the next hour or so. And if you have questions as we get started, hold on to them. We'll take them toward the end. Courtney will give me the signal when we're 20 minutes from time or so. Unless you just can't help yourself and I've screwed something up and you got to yell it out, then go ahead and do that. We'll play it loose. My name's Eric Celeste. My day job is I'm the Director of Publications for Learning Forward, which is a national teacher advocacy group. We advocate for high-quality professional development for teachers that improve student outcomes. And then my side job is I'm the city columnist and education writer for D Magazine in Dallas, and I run an education blog called Learning Curve. And I've been covering Dallas ISD for about 4 years now. I know I was covering it while our current TA commissioner, Mike Morath, was a superintendent. If you want to hear the stories, you come afterwards. We have drinks, and you ply me with those, and then I'll share those. And so I want the panel here. By Skype, I think we have, right? Representative Dan Huberty. We have State Board of Education Chairwoman Donna Bahorich. We have Senator Larry Taylor and Representative Harold Dutton. And like I said, I think, round of applause for those folks. Thanks for taking time, guys, to talk about education. Now, the panel here is titled A Path Forward, but I want to start with a few days ago, and then we'll move forward from that. I was actually in Mexico over the weekend, and I came back on Monday and said, what happened did any news happen on Friday? And checked my social media feeds. And the only thing I saw was that Ruffin Odor punched a Toronto Blue Jay. That was all that was there. And so it took about 2 days until somebody said, what did you think about the Supreme Court decision on Texas finance? I said, when did that happen? So I'm still catching up. So let's start with, check out our Skype feed. Representative Huberty, when you heard about the Supreme Court decision, what was your first reaction? And what do you think this means for you guys going to the next session?
Yeah, I was a little surprised initially. I think that, it was interesting timing at the GOP convention when there was a lot of other stuff going on, so I don't know if that was planned or not, but the reality I was a little surprised, because I knew a lot of the people involved in it, but, clearly if you read the ruling that came out from Willett, the 100-page ruling that came out, and they addressed all the issues, I think that obviously, clearly, the arguments made were particularly interesting because it was all based on finances and a lot of speculation. But we still have some issues to it. So even though there's not a mandate from the courts to do that, we still have problems like, the ASETAR goes away in 2017. So we got to figure out how to deal with that particular situation. You still have school districts that are at the maximum cap, over 300 that are at the max cap. You still have situations where we're underfunding special education programs in the state of Texas. So if you read it, what they're saying is that performance-based solution, or the performance of the students has done very well. We rank, first or second graduation rates across all demographics. But their comment was something along the lines that it's not, a perfect system, but certainly there's room for improvement. And so they basically kicked it back to the legislature, said these are things that you have to fix. They mentioned cost of education index, all the things that we know internally we should still address, and I think we need to address them. I mean, it's a system that's had a Band-Aid put on it for 20 years, and we have to go back and address some of these issues. It's a very dated system. So I was very surprised that all of the findings were in the state's favor. I didn't think that the plaintiffs were going to win a lot of them, but I was very surprised about it.
Senator Taylor, when he talks about kicking it back now to the legislature, you can look at it and say, well, we have done some things well, 89% high school graduation rate. for public school students, but 17% college ready rate. So those things don't align. So, you know, and didn't the decision say, yes, technically, this is what Texas is doing is okay, but that doesn't, but you guys have a lot of work to do coming up?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it's kind of like your air conditioner. You have your summer pre-check, and the guy comes out and checks out your air conditioner, and it'll only cool down to 90 degrees. It's as cool as it'll get, and your bills are through the roof, but it's still working. So he says, well, I wouldn't recommend working on it. We obviously have a lot to do in education. We have improved a lot. Now, remember, a lot of these lawsuits started in 2011. We've had 2 sessions where we've added more money. We've done a lot of things. So I think the justices were looking at that we have made improvement, but there's still a long way to go. We're looking at some formulas that are 25, 30 years old. Cost of education index was brought up in an earlier panel. There's a lot of things we need to do, and this basically takes away that cloud that's been hanging over us. You know, there's been some discussion about working on school finance in the legislature, which is very difficult. I mean, this is not an easy project by any stretch, but you can't possibly take that on while you have a pending Supreme Court decision hanging out there. So the fact that they've now cleared that above us so we can actually go in there and really work on it and try to come up with a solution that brings us into the 21st century, I welcome the opportunity. I'm glad that they've done what they did.
Well, so what I'm...
and I'll just add one more thing. You know, we've had just a series of Supreme Court decisions, and in my view, this is not the Supreme Court's job to come up with what is an adequate and efficient education system. They should be looking for the way out of line things, which they did way back with Edgewood and those types of things. But when you start getting into how much we should be spending and saying whether that's not enough, that's not the Supreme Court's job. And I thought they showed great judicial restraint in leaving it to the legislature, which is our job, is to do those types of things. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, but I welcome the opportunity for them to step back and let us do our work.
So one way to interpret that, Representative Dutton, would be we were going to fix school finance just as soon as this is over. Well, now it's over, and is school finance going to get fixed? And do you agree with what the other 2 representatives have said so far?
Well, yeah, I guess I agree somewhat. I mean, I wasn't surprised about what the Supreme Court did. You know, playing football, you always expected on 4th down for the other team to punt. And I expected the Supreme Court to do that in some fashion, and they did it. They said that our system was minimally constitutional, and so that essentially kicked it back to us. I think, as Chairman Taylor has said, whether or not we'll fix it or not, it depends on what you mean by fix. As I listened to the Lieutenant Governor, it seems to me that he talked about new ideas, but a lot of the fixes were really old ideas. I mean, with things that haven't, you know, in my opinion, been successful. I should start out by saying that this is my 16th session in the legislature. 15 of those sessions I spent on public education. Now, I sometimes have hesitated to audiences to say that because they blame me for everything that happened. But I tell them I'm an expert. I'm an expert in what we didn't do and what we didn't fix. And from my perspective, it seems to me that we have talked about having education reform at different times, and this education miracle and all those kind of things. And really the thing for me has always been, we still have never made an attempt even to fix education at the bottom. We still have far too many students that are 1, 2, 3, and 4, and even 5 grade levels behind. Those are the students, I think, who haven't been treated fairly by our system, whether it's from the finance point of view or whether it's from the just education point of view. I think at some point we're going to have to figure out a way in which we can accomplish education reform that really and truly looks at these kids. We spent a lot of time in House Bill 2 trying to figure out whether or not we ought to have Algebra 2, for example, as a basis for graduation. And yet, there are far too many students, who were struggling with general math. And we didn't say anything in House Bill 2 regarding those folks and those students and how we resolve their issues. And so I hope when we start talking about fixing public education, we start fixing education not just by raising the ceiling, but by raising the floor.
And isn't part of the problem when you say that, that the people who invariably are struggling the most are our poorest children, and it's hard to find as many advocates for them.
Well, yeah, nobody, I mean, it's like I said, we were talking about how parents sometimes don't go to the schools. Well, you know, it's kind of like, you know, if your son's playing football, but he's not playing, he's just on the team, you might not choose to go to the game either. But if your child was succeeding, you know, you tend to be a little bit more positive about school. If the student is performing well, then you're more positive, you get those parents coming. But my position has always been, even if parents don't come, we still have an obligation to educate them.
And isn't it also about, there's one thing to say we're going to do something about it now, it's another to, you know, the funding is an expression of your priorities. And the last session, there was a $7 billion surplus, $4 billion goes to roads, and $4 billion to corporate tax cuts, or at least suggested, increase in border funding, but only $118 million goes to pre-K, which is
Well, yeah, $118 million out of how much went to education?
out of the $300 to $400 million that was asked for by pre-K advocates.
No, but yeah, if you're picking one small part of education, how much did we spend on education?
Well,
It's half the budget of state
About
spending.
38 cents out of every dollar.
So we want to talk
spend.
about priority. I'm sorry, I got to disagree
That's
with your
fine, that's
premise.
fine.
You pick one part and compare that to total budgets and other things we've done. That's not exactly a fair comparison.
Is it fair, though, and I'll accept that, is it fair to say, though, that it's important that, because I've heard from this legislature a lot, that throwing money at the problem doesn't help. It's about funding high-quality programs that work. And I would argue high-quality pre-K takes more money than that. But do you think that there will be in this next session, I'll turn back this way. Do you think in this next session that there will be some agreement on change levers that can be funded to help people on the floor and to make significant changes where they need to be?
Are you talking?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Well, once again, I am a big believer that just throwing more money at something doesn't fix it. It is how you spend the money. Pre-K has some questions as to that, and we want to make sure it's going to quality pre-K, because there's a lot of pre-K that hasn't proven to make a difference for those kids. So anytime you want to measure how well you're doing something just by how much you spend on it, you're going to have a problem with me. Because I think we can implement a lot of new technologies and things in our education system and get a far better education than we're getting today, and it may not cost as much. Ask any industry across this country what they're doing today that's the same as they did 10 years ago. Very little. And they've implemented technology where they could, and they've become more efficient. They've gotten a lot more bang for their buck. And I think we can do that in education. So I don't go along with the idea we're going to measure our desire to improve education by how much money we throw at it. It's where you put the money. If you have two programs, and one of them's doing great guns, and they cost the same amount of money as the other program that's not doing well, guess what? Take the money from this program and give it to this one, you get double the bang of the buck, and rather than waste on that deal. So it's not a matter of just throwing more money. It's how you spend it and trying to improve our efficiency, our technology, improving our teachers. There's so many things we can do better rather than just continue to do the same old that we've done. That's, you know, we've had some improvement, but we all agree we're not where we need to be. And we have kids that we're leaving behind. And my goal and belief is we should not leave any kid in Texas behind. They should all be given the opportunity to get a great education so they can go out and get a great job and be great citizens for our future.
Chairwoman Bahorich, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, you know, I appreciate the legislators taking up in the last session the call to early education. You know, early does matter. The board had a learning roundtable in November of last year where we had Dr. Chuck Weaver from Baylor University come and speak to us about the science of learning and that sort of thing. One of the things he covered was that for a 10-year-old child that is reading at a 90th percentile level versus one reading at a 10th percentile level, the difference in exposure from that 10th percentile child to the 90th percentile child at 10 years old is already at 200 times difference exposure to print and just the whole concept of reading and books and all of that sort of thing, that when you're at a school system trying to overcome a 200 times deficit already at 10 years old, you've got a major hill to climb. And so I applaud the legislatures for working on this last session, and I expect that more work's going to go on this next session.
And so when, to that end, when you talk about new technologies, I was just talking to Stacy Hawk from the Next Generation Commission on Assessments and Accountability. Let's talk about the work they're doing and how that might impact the next session. From chatting with her, I know some themes are starting to develop in those presentations around better technologies for testing and assessing. Do you think that, what do you see happening coming out of that committee and how that's going to be addressed by the legislature?
Oh, well, I'm very optimistic. We've had some great discussions. Stacey's been a part of that. We've met almost monthly since we started. We have a broad spectrum of people involved. And that was the whole point of that commission, is to bring in stakeholders from all across the educational system, along with some experts in testing and those kind of things, as well as some legislators. And what we're looking at is, we've gone from STAR, TAX, TEACS, all these things. We keep changing it, and the ball keeps moving, and they're not always aligned. And what we're trying to do is get all the stakeholders to come up with, what do we want our kids to learn through their public school career? And what's the best way to do it? What's the best way to measure that? And I think one of the things we've come up with so far is, first of all, our educational system should be geared towards the student, because we know we have students of all different styles of learning and different talents. We should be reaching all those students. So our testing should not just be testing school districts and school campuses. What about the child? We should be getting the results for the child's benefit. It should become earlier in the school year, when they take their first little test. They find out where they individually are, and they know where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are, and the teacher can actually implement that during that school year. Where can we help little Johnny or Sue to improve in the areas where they're weak while it's timely, versus waiting till the end of the year, taking a test, and they got to come back next year. Now, last year you didn't do real well. Well, guess what? Now they're a whole year behind. So I think one of the biggest things we've come out of this is make it more, yes, we want to measure districts and campuses, but we want to measure students and give them usable information back from that test that they can use to better and improve their educational opportunities during that school year in a more timely fashion. So that's one of the biggest things. Would you agree, Stacey? I think we've got great consensus around that. So we'll be designing and promoting a test that will be more timely to our students.
Representative Hutton, you have anything to add?
I was just going to, I was thinking back to what the chairwoman said about
Hello.
program. Two things about that. Probably one is, we knew at the time when we funded it that this wasn't going to catch all kids, for example. And I for one, thought it would have been a better use of the money that we had to spend it on these kids, because the same amount of money we spent on trying to protect the border, which I didn't quite understand. But the other part about it, which is left me even more perplexed, is I felt that we should have put the money in the school funding formula as opposed to using it on the basis of grants, because school districts, in responding to grants, are not likely to try to implement it in terms of a program that's now going to be there forever. They're going to look at it and, well, like they do in most cases, it becomes a sort of almost an adjunct to the whole process, when in fact what we have to have is a kindergarten system that actually feeds into first grade, so that every child who gets to first grade is first grade ready. And yet what we did is we designed a program that probably accommodated probably 50% of the students out there who are eligible for kindergarten. And so I hope when we get back to the session next time, that's one of the things we'll do, is we'll fix it so that it's part of the formula funding method. And number two, that it reaches out and captures far more children in it. Because what we did is simply said, okay, if you already got a program and it's successful, we're going to let you do that, without recognizing that there are plenty kids out there who might well benefit from full-day kindergarten but didn't get to it.
How do you balance the need for assessment and testing with the pushback you get politically for too much high-stakes testing and the feeling that you're creating a system, or that inadvertently the system is being created where the testing for testing's sake and it's not actually helping give the information that's needed to get these kids up where they need to be.
Well, we spend more money on
He's
testing.
back.
Oh, he's back. we spend more money on advertising about the test than we spend on advertising about reading, for example. I mean, to me, and I have this discussion all the time with people in my district who ask, well, why are teachers teaching to the test? And I said, well, wait a minute now. If the test is supposedly representative of what you learned, why wouldn't they be teaching to it? I mean, it doesn't make sense any other way. Why would you test on something that you didn't teach? And so, when you go back in the history of this testing, one of the things you realize is that all of this started out as a way in which we could have a system to diagnose how students were doing, and at some point we flipped it around and said, oh, no, now we're going to make it a bar to even graduating or to being promoted to the next grade. If testing is going to be a barrier, then I think we're going to have to put far more money into education to make sure every kid can get there, because there's still discrepancies, extreme discrepancies inside school districts, where you'll have one side of town that just can't make it. It bothers me still that if you tell me where a school is located, I can tell you how well they did on the standardized testing.
And the New York Times had a tremendous graphic recently that showed within those districts also a lot of those differences just on racial grounds.
That's been a good part of it, because in my district, for example, and I think the Lieutenant Governor hit on this at least in part, many of the students get on a bus every morning to go across town to get an education. They ride by all kinds of schools that we ought to fix, and so rather than some of these other alternatives, I think we need to fix the low-performing schools that these kids are locked into. And it seems to me that we can do that if we really, and I think it's another thing the Lieutenant Governor said, if we have the will. Well, in order to have the will, what does that mean? That means that if Kashmere High School, which is in my district, the students don't do well on the standardized testing because they don't do well on the math portions of the test. But then you also, in peeling it back, you look and see that none of these students ever had a certified math teacher. Then you got to wonder, well, okay, well then why are all the certified math teachers located in another part of town, in another school? Why can't somebody say, look, why don't we send these certified math teachers over to Kashmere so that we can get these students caught up? And he mentioned one other thing. He talked about doing it as a business. Well, in a business, you never send your worst people to your worst problem. But that's what we do in education.
Do you want to add? Oh, go ahead.
All I was going to say was that that's one of the things that, we've heard a lot today about bringing practitioners into this discussion, and with the next generation of assessments and accountability, one of the functions that the board has taken on as a member of one of the 15 members, is to gather feedback from around the state. And so I traveled to various locations in the state from January through March. Every week I was in a different location to gather information from parents, business leaders, and educators regarding this particular discussion that's so important to what are we going to do moving forward with assessments and accountability. And one of the things, if you do a word cloud, and I know that's not a scientific thing necessarily, but if you do a word cloud based on the feedback that we got, the words that kind of come up so often are individual, growth, multiple measures. Those were common themes that people brought up during the discussions, and I've heard that also at the commission hearings as being a big focus. How are we going to measure growth? How are we going to look at multiple measures, as was already mentioned here today by some of our speakers, to tell how our students are doing? How are we going to concentrate on that individual and get that individual where that individual needs to go? Because that's exactly what we need to worry about.
And if I could, generally I agree with what Representative Dutton has said, that you can generally tell how well the school is going to do on some of these tests based on their zip code, but there are exceptions. And that's what we need to be exploring and finding out. How are the exceptions doing far better than their peers based on demographic ratios and all that? And there are schools that are doing these things in very difficult areas. They're performing very well. And rather than just settling, well, that's just a difficult area to work, we just can't do any better. When there's someone out there making an exception to that, we need to be finding out what they're doing, and then we need to be importing that into these areas where it's not working well. And I think a lot of it sometimes, unfortunately, is expectations.
Well,
There's lowered expectations. Well, these kids, they're not they don't have any money, they're not going to do well. I think we're a victim of our own expectation that we need to raise the expectations on these kids. And these kids, you give them an expectation, they'll do everything they can to reach it. If you lower that expectation, they're doing everything they can to reach that, and they don't know there's anything beyond that.
And that's very true. Todd Williams at Commit in Dallas and in Houston has done great work in showing that your demographics are not destiny, and that there are high-achieving schools in each demographic group. But if Representative Huberty, if we're gonna bettering our measurement tools and our assessment tools is important, and everyone agrees that, but you do get, I'm assuming, a lot of feedback from parents about, well, that may be true, but we don't want to feel like my child is just taking tests, and we don't want high stakes testing, et cetera. How do you balance those two things?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I can deal with this from two ways. One is a legislator, the second is a parent. I've got kids in the system. One that's going in and taking the EOCs now, and the other two in middle school, so one in high school, a couple in middle school. We started a lot of the reassessment, or a lot of the dealing with the tests, especially with, when Jimmy Don did, Chairman Aycock, when we did HB 5, and then we had HB 743 on reducing the time limit. But I'll never forget, my daughter was sitting there with my wife one day, and we were talking about testing, and they both looked at me and told me, this is all my fault, so you better fix it. So I said, okay, well, let's go ahead and fix it. And so what can we fix? What are the things that we can do? Yeah, there is a balance. We have, we measure what we treasure. We have to make sure that we have the ability to have testing so that we understand that our children are learning, that they're getting the good baseline. But at what point does it become too much? And that's that's some of the things that we need to take into consideration. One of the things that I thought was interesting, again, and it's just food for thought, but when you read about the implementation of STAR testing and how much more difficult it was versus what the tax testing was, and the fact of the matter, and then you start talking to teachers and you start talking to parents, one of the things that we're finding is that a lot of the material that perhaps was being tested wasn't being covered, and I'd rather our kids get information delivered in such a way that we're not worried about testing. My sixth, and this is really important, my sixth grader said to me, he says, Dad, I really don't need to go to school anymore. And I said, why is that? He says, well, we already took the test, there's nothing left to do. Now, that's alarming to me, is that you've got 2 to 3 weeks left in the school, they figure they've taken all their tests and that there's nothing else left to do. So, the balance has to be with assessing where we're doing and making sure that we're getting through the TEKS, which is, from what the State Board of Education is doing in the reevaluation of the TEKS and reducing the TEKS. And I know that there was some pushback on one of the bills that got vetoed last session of getting to the point where we're getting that the TEKS redone. But the TEKS are are a mile wide and an inch deep, and so what do we really want to teach the kids?
Can I, for Dan to talk about his son, it's sad that he thinks education is about taking a test, and then once the test is over, he's done. But what's even sadder is when a school system thinks that they're done after they've done the test. When they start bringing out the movies and all this, those are opportunities to teach kids. Maybe you do mini courses in personal finances or something. You still should be educating those kids for the whole 180 days. But there are numerous examples of schools. They've done the test, they're kind of shutting down, and I just think that's a travesty. I understand a young man thinking that. I mean, it's sad that that's how it equates education, but beyond that,
yeah,
for a school system.
Larry, he's okay with it, by the way.
No, I know. No, I know that,
fine.
and I was your son, so I mean, I get that. But we need to have higher expectations of the children and push them to do things that they don't even think they want to do or know that they can do.
Well, and I know I think there was a panel earlier in the day on this, but we have to measure and have higher expectations for the children. We have to do it for the principal driver of excellence for our children, the teachers. There was a teacher evaluation discussion last session that there was nothing new produced. Do you think that there will be there will be more talk and more work toward some sort of teacher evaluation system statewide.
I believe that was my bill. But at least we worked on it, if nothing else. But that was a big deal to us because we all talk about teacher quality, and we had a bill that we worked on very hard to get across the line, having to do with finding where a teacher actual skills were and align that with what they did during the summer to improve their skills. And it got taken over and hijacked by one of the teacher groups putting out absolute lies, saying we were cutting all the teacher salaries to $29,000. And I mean, it was a blatant, absolute lie, had no relation to truth in any way, but they poured it on in such a manner. We fought the battle, went ahead and passed it out of the Senate, but the House was not going to take up that bill because such a firestorm went around it, and it was totally unfounded. And that bill was about improving our teachers. And, you know, this is where I have a little difficulty. You heard Lieutenant Governor talking about when we talk about improving education, we're not blaming every educator or every school district. But by the same token, when we're trying to do some kind of reform that helps those that are not doing as well, and every other teacher or group or organization stands up and defends them, I do have a problem with that. They're standing in the way of reforms that need to be done. We should not be protecting the worst. We should all be looking for ways to improve. And for some groups to stand up and try to defend the worst, I do have a problem with that.
So and I've written a lot backing Dallas ISD's teacher, that's us, teacher evaluation system that they put in place that Commissioner Morath had a lot to do with designing, because it did do a tremendous job in its first year of identifying teachers that were not up to par and identifying those who were being underpaid, and we're doing a great job. What it still lacks doing, and I think part where a lot of this fear for teachers comes in, is that it doesn't take the next necessary step, which is show you what success looks like, actually work as a professional development tool, and use it in a growth manner for us. And so that's where that fear comes from. So if you're designing a system, it just can't be punitive. Would you agree, Representative Dutton?
Well, yeah, I don't think you can design a system that's totally punitive, but I do think it's difficult to design a system that helps a teacher understand or to raise the teacher's expectations of students. I mean, when we talk about expectations, you know, I find that students always do probably a little bit less than your expectations. But what happens more often than not is teachers in particular communities have lower expectations of those students simply because of where they are. And yet, you know, it wasn't too far back in our history that when you had segregated schools, those same areas produced students that were giants in education. And so what changed? I mean, what happened? I think in part it had to do with the expectations of teachers. And if I were trying to teach teachers anything, it would be that, look, let me teach you how to raise your expectation level, particularly for students who are not doing so well. That you don't want to lower your expectations simply because these students are perceived as not coming with all the right bells and whistles that other students have. It's easy to have high expectations for students at Memorial High School, for example, than it is to have high expectations for students at Wheatley High School or Cashmere High School, for example. It's easy to do that. But that's exactly what part of the problem is. And so when you start talking about evaluating teachers, you know, at some point I think you can do that, but I think where we are now, we're simply, you know, finding somebody to blame instead of trying to fix the problem. And as long as we engage in that, we're going to keep finding scapegoats because we keep looking for them.
So, still us? Okay, just making sure I wasn't leaving out Representative Huberty. And so on another teacher issue, will you be addressing the pipeline concerns for high-quality teachers that are in Texas? It's a nationwide problem. It's district by district problem. Fewer high-quality certification groups. There are some, but there's not enough, and not enough high-quality teachers coming into the pipeline. And a lot of those that are are coming in to these highly politically fraught areas in the urban areas. I in Dallas, for example, where they're walking right into a situation where they've got to worry about so many things besides what's going on in that classroom. So it keeps a lot of high-quality candidates. The incentives aren't always there for those pipelines.
Eric, could I ask you a question?
Sure.
Let me ask you a question. How do you know whether a teacher's high quality?
So that's what the evaluation's for, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I'll bet if I asked everybody in here to give me the 10 things that would help us identify a high-quality teacher, it would be most unusual for everybody to have the same 10.
Well, the teachers I talk to, they all are. But I think when you're talking about district-wide, or statewide, aren't there things you have to do to measure them and determine what is high quality and what's low quality?
That's what I'm saying. I think we start to label it, and what you get is something different. I remember I was in New York and I was listening at the teacher, I forgot her name, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now. She won the Teacher of the Year award. And they asked her why was she so successful at teaching English, and she said the first 3 years she was teaching English. But after that, she realized she was teaching students. And so she began to adapt what she was attempting to do to the students who showed up in her classroom, as opposed to trying to force them to come to where she was. She decided to go to where they were. Well, she took students who were probably 2 and 3 grade levels behind, and now after they left her class, they were probably half that. Well, is that a high-quality teacher?
I think you make an excellent point. I think the problem that I know Dallas had, and I think other districts have, is the only way they've got to measure that for the past 100 years was a calendar and perhaps some advanced degrees. They're looking for ways to try to measure that, so that whether you're successful or not, you have to start putting in systems in place to try that.
I'll tell you, one thing I think you measure that you have to include in that is student growth. It doesn't matter where they were when they started your class, but if you haven't advanced at least a year during that year that you had them, you're not doing a good job. But beyond that, you can walk on any campus in this state and ask them who the best teacher is, and there will be a general consensus who the very best teachers are. And you can also ask the reverse of that, who are the worst teachers? And there will be a general consensus who are the worst teachers. That is not difficult to measure. And that's where some of this peer-to-peer doing evaluations as a part of an evaluation system. You have the teacher who's really working their tail off, gets there at 7 a.m., is tutoring before class, works through lunch, stays after school and tutors some more, and then they're right across the hall is another teacher who shows up right before the kids get there and leaves right after the kids get there. Their kids aren't doing well in their stuff. I think it's pretty easy to tell who the good teacher is. And that's one of the problems we have with keeping good teachers in teaching is they see that. It's very frustrating. They're getting paid exactly the same as that teacher across the hall is doing almost the minimal, the least they can do, and the kids are suffering for it, but they get paid the same. I would be frustrated in that situation. And so I think you ought to be able to have some kind of a way of evaluating, and a lot of it's peer-to-peer, some of it's student growth, but there are measures that we could put in place to measure how a teacher is doing in a classroom, and I think we have to do that, or we don't, like you said, how do you know if he or she's a good teacher?
But the problem with that, Larry, is we don't reward students for growth. We reward students for whether they get an A or B. I mean, and instead of saying, okay, I got into this class, I'm in the 9th grade, but I'm functioning at the 7th grade. But when I leave here, I need to be functioning at 8th grade. Well, is that progress for that teacher? It's difficult. I mean, I understand the difficulty of it, but at some point, you got to say, well, look, measuring teachers, measuring students, measuring administrators, measuring, superintendents, measuring principals. I mean, we spend a lot of time doing that, and I'm not sure at this point whether or not it means a whole lot, because at the end of the day, when we start doing student testing, for example, we argued about whether it ought to be 15 or 5 tests, but it doesn't matter to me because I can tell you who's going to be at the bottom, whether or not you get 1 test or 1,000. The same students are going to be at the bottom of the rung.
So measuring, is there, because that's the best, I know the TEI system in Dallas is about measuring growth. It's about taking in multiple inputs and trying to, and see where you are and how are we going to measure your growth after that. Is there a way to do that when you're putting together, and I would argue it's, what you're saying is incredibly important. It's, I make arguments all the time that our reporting on what school systems are excellent is terrible. People just assume suburban schools are great when, you know, they're taking students who have tremendous advantages and growing them almost nothing in no way and getting great report cards, whereas you've got schools in Dallas that have tremendous challenges and are moving their students, and yet here come the newspaper reports about who's doing well or not, and they're not factoring that in. Is there a way that the state can measure that and reward and promote schools that are doing that well?
I'd just like to say, along with what you're saying, the Urban Institute last year put out a report that looked at the NAEP scores for Texas and looked at all the NAEP scores across the country in English and math for both 4th and 8th graders. And what they found is if you normalize the data based on the kids that are walking through the door, basically, and evened all things out across all the states, Texas ends up like 3rd in the country with the kids that we've got. Because I think our school districts, our school system has really tried to push forward and make all kids successful. Now, there's not one person, I don't think, in any school system in the state that says, oh, well, that's good, we're good to go. Nobody's saying that. But if you only look at raw scores, you get a different picture because it's not taking into consideration the kids that you have in that particular school. There's a big difference between how you're doing with a 90% economically disadvantaged population coming into your school and one that's a 0% economically disadvantaged. If you look at a regression line, those as the higher you're economically disadvantaged, the lower your scores are going to be. So you have to have some way to look at that and to say, yes, but we're moving these kids forward. We know that they've got many challenges to overcome, but we are moving them forward. And I think that we'll see an accountability system that's going to take that into consideration as part of it, not just looking straight raw scores, and that's the only way we tell whether we're failures or whether we've done the job we're supposed to.
I was going to say one other thing to that. I mean, we have a system where we group students really based on age. I mean, we started at first grade. You got to be 6 by September 1st or whatever it is. Right. I mean, I always said that just discriminates against parents who had fun on New Year's Eve. But it seems to me that if we really want to measure growth, we ought to start grouping students by their abilities,
exactly,
as opposed to their age.
Forget the grade.
Forget the grade, yeah.
Absolutely.
That I mean, I had some students who came to visit me at the Capitol, and one little girl was 5th grade, and the teacher, I asked her she asked me what kind of card I have, and I told her, and I said, what kind do you have? She said, no, but I'll tell you what I'm going to get. I said, what? She said, a Lamborghini. I said, I bet you can't even spell Lamborghini. Because I couldn't, but she spelled it. And then the teacher said, Mr. Dutton, she's actually the smartest kid at our school, but she doesn't come to school.
Wow.
And I thought, well, wait a minute. If she's the smartest person in school, but she doesn't come to school, why doesn't somebody fix it? Because she's clearly bored.
Yeah, she's not challenged.
She's not being challenged. And why don't you move her to another grade, or move her to a 6th or 7th grade where she more properly fits? Teacher said, oh, Mr. Dunn, y'all won't let us do that. I thought,
I'm glad to hear we have an ally, because I'm a big proponent of that as well. We need a child-centered education, because kids learn at different paces, at different age levels. Their brains have developed different areas. Some of them can do math earlier, some of them can't. And if you give them the math too early, they think they're a failure at math. And they go through the rest of life thinking, I'm not good at math, where if you'd given it to them 2 and 3 years later, we've had examples of that, where the kid goes on to be a math major and does incredible things.
Well, and you need the training and the tools made available to the school so they can do differentiated teaching like that in those classrooms.
In today's 21st century, we have that technology.
And I know that's what Stacy was.
We can track kids individually. You don't have to track them in groups. Back a long time ago, they didn't have the data processing that we have today. They had to put them in groups so you could manage and keep up with them. But we're beyond that. We should be able to track and if we hear about mobile students, kids that move we should be able to track from this school to that school to that school and still measure not whether they're growing. And we should be able to do that with the data we have. And just one more plug for productivity. You talk about reading levels and being able to advance. Using electronic devices, a teacher can't sit down and read and work with one student for the whole class, but they can use, with good use of electronic devices, those devices will help them read. Right. They can read along, they come to a word they don't know, click it, it'll pronounce it for them, it'll tell them what it means. Think how that can grow every individual student so much faster. That's efficiency, and it doesn't involve having to hire another teacher. It's getting some electronic devices to supplement what the teacher is doing. That's how you get more efficiencies and get a better education.
I know Courtney was out there somewhere saying we should probably start taking questions.
I thought we were going to reception or something. Can we ask questions at the reception?
I think there will be those as well. Does anyone have a question
Ask questions.
they would like to ask?
I know there's going to be lots of questions for these guys, but there will be drinks, open bar in 20 minutes.
Is that on tape?
So let's get some good questions to close this out with a bang.
Eric, you talked a little bit about some of the political footballing that's been happening in one particular community in the state. And for those of you on the panel, I'm wondering, to what extent do you see hope for just cutting through a lot of that noise at either the local level or at the state level to build a really constructive narrative that lifts up teachers and makes them feel as though this is really important work that they're choosing to do? And I've heard you, Chairman, talk a little bit about sort of lifting up the teaching profession at the joint hearing on education and higher education a couple weeks ago. So I know it's something we definitely need to do, but what do you think is our best hope for doing that?
Well, part of where you start is you have a higher threshold to get into the School of Education or get into teaching. You know, the idea that we have teachers who didn't do well academically themselves, how is that possible? We expect them to do any better passing on to someone else if they weren't even academically successful themselves. So I think you start with some raising the GPAs required to get into education. I think you also pay teachers based on some achievement levels and doing things, and get off this everybody gets paid the same, the only exception being how many years you've been there, whether or not you got a master's. There are things we need to do to make it, we talk about treating teachers as professionals, and then we do just exactly the opposite. Because we group them all together, you're all going to get paid the same, doesn't matter if you excel or whatever. That's not going to work. For a high-performing student or a person, that's not what they're going to desire to do unless they have just a calling to education, which a lot of people do, and I'm all for that. But we have a lot of other bright people who have a lot to offer education if we would make it something that looks desirable that they want to get into. But start of that is you've got to raise the GPA where people realize you didn't just slide into education. It wasn't like your last option. It's something you strove to do, and you had to get over some hurdles to get there. That'll raise the respect that we have. And we have this in other countries. They don't pay their teachers anymore, but it's just much more of an esteemed position where the society as a whole, like we used to do here, frankly. We really valued our teachers, and we looked up to them, we respected them, and a lot of that's, discipline in the schools. We have teachers quitting because there's no discipline in the schools. We should make that absolute. You don't violate the discipline of the teacher in the classroom, or you're going to go somewhere else, or we're going to do something else with you. We have to give the teacher the respect they deserve for the job they're doing. They are doing the most important work we have. We can't afford to pay them all, outrageous amounts of money because there's just not that kind of money. So some of it is a calling, but they are doing important work for the future of this country and this state.
I think, one of the things I would really like to see for teachers is a much more intentional approach toward a career ladder for them. I think we have not spent enough time thinking about how to create things to aspire to and stay a teacher and do what you do best. It cannot be to just go into administration where we lose all that talent that could be better spent in the classroom or in replicating themselves and getting other people to be able to be at that level of proficiency. So I would really like to see some real intentional work at developing positions. There are some teachers that can take 35 kids in a class because they are just able to do it with not a problem.
Pay them more.
Yeah, But pay them more for that kind of stuff. Usually what we do with the great teachers is we just give them more work. We don't give them more opportunity. We just give them more work, and that just cannot be.
And not nearly, and this is where I'll get off my soapbox for my organization, not nearly enough time spent on high-quality professional development, not nearly enough time made and emphasis made for that, so it's not a one-time sit and get program, but it's baked into your daily routine, to your weekly routine. That's what they do in Hong Kong. That's what they do in Shanghai. That's where you have where they're teaching 18 hours a week, 22 hours a week, and they're spending a lot of their other time doing professional development that makes them feel like they're part of a profession and a group that takes them seriously. And finding ways to incentivize that, I think, for you guys and for districts is crucial. And I won't even get into my other soapbox about the other problem with that narrative you talk about, which is the way I think most big city media report on education issues. They look for sensational, they don't look at them as education beats. They look at them as political beats. And so it's real easy there's almost no discussion about the components of the teacher evaluation system in Dallas, about what's going on that's like it, what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now that's similar, what's happening in other places that's similar, how does the research show these aspects of it are working. What you get are trustees who will complain about it on speed dial. You call them up, you get 2 quotes, trustees against new system, and boom, there's your front page story. And that's the way the reporting is done in most major urban markets, and it's shameful that there's no real serious education reporters in most of those places. So that's my soapbox.
We've spoken a lot today about innovation and providing time to do that. I'm wondering, what should we stop doing in order to free up some time for real innovation?
What should we stop doing? A lot of rote memorization stuff. You need to learn basics in today's world, but the idea of just memorizing facts for the sake of memorizing facts, how many of you have younger folks around you? You ask them a question, what do?
Siri.
They ask Siri, they look it up. In 15 seconds, they've got the answer. We can't keep doing education pretending like the internet doesn't exist. It is here. It's no longer a fad. I think it's going to stick around for a while. And we need to do our education in such a way where we dig deeper. It's not just regurgitating facts, but what does that mean? So your educational process and your tests, the idea of whether or not you can take your calculator for these higher level math tests, we've kind of gotten past that, right? Well, why are we not allowing them to use their devices? We need to change how we do the test. So they have to actually think, not just regurgitate the fact, but what did that mean in the American Revolution when so-and-so happened? Something you can't just exactly look up. You go look up the facts, you got to put it together. And that's how you really teach people a depth of learning that they're going to remember for a long time, is those really deep principles and concepts where they've actually thought about it. How many of you studied for a quiz, and then a week later you couldn't have passed that same quiz? That was the way I did school, by the way. I'm just telling you. Probably affects me even today because my memory's still not that good. But the things I really loved and enjoyed, I really learned them, and I knew those, and I can still do those today. I can hear you, but you're not on.
We talked this morning about the 60 by 30 goals and how important really dramatic improvements in outcomes in our K through 12 system is to having success there, and that potentially the introduction of competition or choice to drive change and improvement is one thing that was mentioned by a number of panelists. I was wondering about your thoughts on that.
What was the question again?
School
Thoughts
choice,
on school
parental
choice as a driver for innovation? School choice?
School choice. Well, I'm not a fan of school choice. I will just tell you straight up. I mean, you're still going to have most of the children are going to be in the regular traditional school system. So I'm not sure what you get, but I still think you have to fix the system anyway. And so why not fix it? I mean, if you're going to decide that school choice is one of the options, for example, in my side of town, I would suspect that if school choice were available, it wouldn't be choice on my side of town. It would be just like the situation we have now, where most of the students get on a bus to go across town, to go pass by all of these other schools, to go to another school. It seems to me that we can be smarter than that because we can fix the system, because the more money we take out of the system for school choice, for example, it leaves less money for a lot of the kids and students who are not going to be able to access a private school, for example, that might have benefit from school choice. So I'm not convinced, I'm not a fan, because I'm not convinced that even in where we are, that it provides enough of a solution, a benefit, that it's something we ought to try.
And here's where we don't agree. We have school competition today. If you live in the suburbs where I live, in my area, those people can afford to move around, and they literally pick where they're going to move based on competition. Which, by the way, if you look at all the innovations we're enjoying today, I'd say almost all of them came about because of competition. Very few innovations and improved efficiencies come from any monopoly. They just tend to go get more and more expensive. In fact, if we still had the monopoly system, can y'all imagine what kind of phone we'd have today if it was still the AT&T or Southwestern Bell monopoly? They would not have driven. Competition is what drove us to what we have today. In fact, it was someone from outside the field who revolutionized your cell phone. The smartphone didn't come from AT&T and the phone company. It came from computer companies getting involved with it. I think competition is a driver of innovation, and it will. And what we're trying to do, particularly with parental choice, and frankly the charter movement today, is generally in some of those harder to educate areas, and they are showing for a fact that if you raise the expectation for these kids and you're a little bit more demanding on them, they can reach and achieve the same goals in academic performance that other people can outside that area. So what we're trying to do with parental choice is actually bring the choices into those areas that cannot afford the choice today. And I just think it's a huge driver.
Well, I was going to say, I might agree with you if you had real competition, but I don't think there's competition when you have a bad school around the corner and a great school across town. That's not competition.
Well, what we're seeing with charters, they're not across town in all cases. In fact, what you see in a lot of cases is some of those public schools that aren't doing well fighting against the addition of more charter schools.
Well, but you also see a lot of them doing things after the snapshot day, sending a lot of their kids on over to the charter school because they recognize that benefit, there's a benefit in it to the traditional school, because these kids are no longer going to be affecting their accountability rating. Now, I just don't think that when you try to apply competition principles to public schools, that you end up with the right outcome, because, again, I think the competition ought not to be between a good school, a great school anywhere, and a bad school close to these kids. I think if you really fix the schools and you make those schools equal in terms of how they can address the students' educational needs, then you got real competition. Then you can choose. Then you have a real choice. But now you don't have a real choice, because
If your school that's not doing well has competition, what happens?
What's competition? I mean,
If someone's doing a much better job with their students, what happens?
well,
Students leave
but
the
we ought
school
to
that's
fix
not
it, though.
working, and they go to the better school, or the school that's not doing a good job improves their performance, they don't lose their students. And that's where competition really raises the tide for all boats.
well, if you really had competition, I agree with you, Larry.
That's what we're trying to do,
but what
really
you
have
don't-
competition.
Well, why not fix the school?
Sometimes the best way to fix something is with competition. We had monopolies for years, and we finally got competition to bear on the thing, and we've improved a lot of things with competition.
Well, and
These were things we thought we couldn't have competition on.
But these aren't-
Power, phones.
I understand, but trying to equate phones to kids, I think, invites a whole different conversation. But
Competition's competition.
well, but I don't think you can necessarily say that having a voucher, which allows you to go to this school, is going to improve the school in the neighborhood.
It will either improve it, or they'll all move to the one that's working. And the school, and the student, not the school, but the student will benefit from that. And that's really that's the child-centered education versus school-centered. The purpose of public education is not for the benefit of the institution or the adults that work within that. The purpose of education is for the benefit of the student.
And I would
And
argue.
I've not seen
And we're
that work
done.
anywhere.
I would argue that when there's strong governance, the choice can work within the district.
It is working. Some districts are doing it.
DISD, for example, has a choice program that is not voucher, which I'm not in favor of, which is based on going to the community and asking what type of school do you want this to be, and then giving funds so that they can create a STEAM school there or an all-girls school here, and giving that community a choice within the district. So they're responding to the principles of competition in the area generally, but there's a governance will there to say we're going to make ours, we're going to fix them. We're not just going to give up on the schools. And I think
Well, that's my whole point is,
So,
I think you ought
I
to.
don't mean to interrupt, but we've got time for one last question.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I would
Well,
love
you
to
did
end
interrupt.
maybe on a little bit differently. So I'm going to give this to DeMargo.
Hey, he's already had his chance.
Harold Larry, I've got
later.
I've got a thought for you on the competition side. One of the things we did at EPISD was to go to open enrollment, which
Absolutely.
allowed within the district and
transfer,
within
yeah.
other districts.
Intra
It's
and
one way to
intra.
do some competition and create some a more positive environment. The other thing I want to make.
Well, can I ask you a question real
Yeah.
quick? So how does that work? Are the
Working
schools
very well.
improving? Are they getting better because
Yeah,
of
the
competition?
competition works. It works.
was transportation a problem in terms of paying for it?
No, the way it's set up in El Paso is they will only provide bus within a certain mile radius. So it was up to the parents if they wanted to move the child to get them there. We didn't have the full availability of the bus system. And frankly, the reason we went to it wasn't just because of dollars and to attract more dollars, given our budget area. It was because of Fort Bliss and the military that wanted it, and it just worked out very well. The other thing I'll tell you is that
Can I just ask a question
Yeah.
too, Dee? The students who are doing most of the traveling, are they coming from a particular area?
No, it's all over.
Pardon?
It's all over. It was a variety. It was dependent, but it was originally what it did is there are some the competition. There's some tremendous elementary schools with great outcomes, dual language, et cetera, and it started forcing the issues. And we went to dual language across the district, starting with kindergarten all the way up. So, my point is that there are ways to create competition without doing away with the public education
Right.
system.
Well, I guess my point though is, why didn't they just provide those programs back at the school these kids were coming from?
Well, part of it was the cost and the
Why not?
implementation.
Ah,
of the
see,
Monopoly.
that's what I mean. So it's not competition, it's the lack of will to provide the funding
Well,
at these schools.
in all these, in not all these cases there was proximity to the parents where they're located for their employment, things like that. There were a myriad of rules and or reasons behind it. But my point is that is one way to create some competition among schools, and we talked about that with the open enrollment, because some students leaving one school to go to a nearby school just because they think it's a better school. The other thing I'd say is that you didn't bring up is I tried to do some things related to merit-based pay for teachers, the ones you described, Larry, the good ones, the ones who are busting it. And the pushback came from the associations.
Yeah.
The pushback came from the associations. Well, I said, well, let's try, I went to the association and said, let's try and create a system to reward the better teachers without basing it on test scores. Get away from the test scores, which we couldn't do. That's the reason our superintendent was in jail. And they refused to do that. The most we could do would be compress the steps, go on, and I kept looking for ways to improve the stipends, et cetera, et cetera. But you didn't say that for some, the associations were a big problem.
Well, I think part of the answer, though, in terms of teacher pay, which I think was discussed at least in part, is first thing we ought to do is make sure that we provide an adequate salary for teachers. And then beyond that, if you want to talk about incentive pay for these kinds of things, that's a great idea, but you don't start out there. When we did the career ladder before, one of the things we finally realized is it was just a legislator's backdoor way to increase teacher pay. I mean, that's really what we were trying to do. And when we get
went
to
to
a point
legislature.
where we provide a basic livable wage as opposed to being built on the system that I think the Lieutenant Governor talked about when there were just women in the teaching profession. The salaries were based around that because from my research tells me that what we did is we thought, well, that was kind of for a female whose husband already had a job. He was working and she had needed something to do, and so she went to teach. And so we've simply built the salary schedule on top of that, but we've never said, well, for I think what the Lieutenant Governor also said, women didn't have certain choices. Those choices now are dictated by money. If you choose to go to Exxon to be a chemist as a woman, or go teach chemistry in high school, there's far difference in the salary that you're going to make. And I think once we get to a point where we can compete with those salaries, then we can talk about whether or not we ought to have incentive pay or not. But until you get to that point, you know, I just find it difficult to talk about trying to create a situation where teachers, some teachers get more pay and some teachers get a reduced pay.
I was just going to say, Susan Hull with Grand Prairie, I think has done some pretty innovative things with regard to creating competition within her schools and between her schools and with charters. She does a school fair, if you will. She invites high-quality charters that are in her area to be a part of this fair to have a parent night, basically, when parents can come and check out all the school options that are available in the area. She's had all the schools have become schools of choice in her district, and she's got a lot of innovative schools that are doing lots of different things that they offer, whether it's arts or science or STEAM or whatever it is, and they've all converted. I think those are innovative things, and that creates competition within the district, and so doing those kinds of things, and including charters, which are public schools, to be a part of that whole conversation for all the parents. You're serving parents, you're serving the children. I really think that's what we need to be doing, and we can create our own competition, which is going to make everyone be better within the system.
All right. So, a couple of things. One, thank you, Eric, for coming in to moderate this panel. Thank you,
And thank you, Chair.
all of you, for taking the time. I think there are a couple of things that are really clear. I think throughout the day, but especially even just this panel, there is a strong commitment to ensure that every child has access to an excellent education and that every child has an excellent teacher. So I think we can see that the way you get there might still be up for discussion, but it looks like we at least have a common goal, which is fantastic for the students of Texas. I'm pretty sure after this last hour, you're probably going to get some phone calls from a few people who are like, "Oh, I need to jump in and talk to you about this issue." So be on the lookout. But I am so appreciative of y'all's time. I mean, y'all are the leaders. Y'all are the ones doing this difficult work, and I very much appreciate it. Thank you all for being here today.